Here we are with part 2 of What If Germany Won World War II. If you haven't checked out part 1, I will leave it in the description below. I'll also do the little card thingy. It'll be in the top right there. Go click it, have a watch. That gives us a lot of background on not exactly how Germany won World War II, but what happened in the wake of Germany winning World War II. I'm sure he'll explain it here. This is part 2 of 4. I'll be recording the next videos over the next couple days. I'm glad that you guys really like the first part. Saw a comment that said just do them back to back, and no one said anything about splitting it up. So, hey, I'm just going to do it back to back. So without further ado, let's just get right into it. Please remember to like, comment, subscribe. It all helps me in the YouTube algorithm, because that's how you really get successful on YouTube, is this random algorithm which we have no control over, pushing your videos out to other people. So yeah, let's get into it. That never works. That was so anticlimactic.
Europe has fallen to Germany. The Allies are nothing more than a...
Did you know that if you hit K on your keyboard, it'll pause your video? Little YouTube trick for you.
Footnote in history, and former Slavic lands are now breadbaskets for the Aryan race. This is part 2 to my series, What If Germany Won World War II? If you haven't watched part 1, click here so you can catch up on the scenario. We left part 1 with a Europe now not only under Nazi occupation, but subjected to fascist dominance as well. In our timeline across the Western world, a counterculture movement split generations apart.
What's wrong with that guy's mouth?
In this alternate timeline, the generations are still divided, however with a cultural split between some of the older generation and their fanatical, indoctrinated children.
Ooh,
the older generation still support the fascist states, but just not to the emotional extent that the newer, more impressionable generation does. Party education teaches not only who was the enemy, but to encourage and train children to use outright violence against those deemed a threat to Germany.
What a fascinating idea that the children of this new German state would be even more fanatical than their parents. That's a really interesting idea. In our timeline, the northern Germany was one of the most, there was the most resistance, so to say, against the Nazi state. It was the only time of outright resistance. I believe there was a protest done, I want to say it was Hamburg, but I know it was in the north in 1943. And that was the actually only open protest against the state that wasn't like, you know, Sophie Scholl and the White Rose movement, but was a large labor protest. And the north was more difficult to Nazify than the south and central Germany. And I wonder if there be any sort of divisions between north, central, and south through moving forward this period, or if the north would get progressively more and more Nazified and become just as fanatic as he says. But that's a really interesting idea, where the older people would be maybe more reserved and less into it than the younger people, because we have to remember too that for the last fair election in Germany, which was in 1932, they only won, I believe it was 33% of the seats. Maybe it was 32, right? So not every single person voted for them in the last free and fair election in the Weimar Republic. So fascinating idea.
Passing generation, children become more violent, fanatical, and devoted to an ever-secured ideology. Education becomes mandatory by the state, but the type of education would be only to solidify the racial ideology of the party, nothing else. History, science, and the humanities are taught in the perspective of the Germans against all, or to shape the mindset of the Aryan destiny. Use of violence against undesirables and military service to the state is idealized and praised. For a man to be a true citizen of Germany, he would have to serve in the armed forces, and for a woman to be married and bear children. To many German children, they were born into a society which actively praises them for just being born. They would have never seen any atrocities or brutality, as those methods rid the fatherland of minorities long ago.
And maybe this would sort of reinforce that old versus young divide, whereas in our timeline it's young versus old, and this time it's more old versus young in that sort of manner, where the men that came back from the front had seen the absolute brutalities of war and how that would sort of influence their children. There's an interesting scene in the movie Der Untergang, otherwise known as Downfall in English, where this man who's clearly a war veteran, and I believe he has his arm missing, He goes up to a group of Hitler youth who are trying to defend the city with an anti-aircraft gun. He tells them all to go home, and he says, you haven't seen real war. And he says, the child says, we're fighting for the fatherland. It's a really, really interesting scene. And I sort of wonder how that dynamic would play out in this timeline. So
any mention of such methods would be praised as actions of heroes and made in the legend.
Right, but
except for the true extent and methods of the Holocaust, which is a closely guarded secret. Throughout this series, I'm sure you've been wondering, wouldn't people eventually revolt against the fascists? Wouldn't they see the oppressive policies and unite against the puppet states and even in Nazi Germany against Hitler himself? How would such a reality even become a reality? Simply from a military victory. The Nazi victory and fascist states they propped up all easily could have fell into disorder or at least civil war, even if Germany won World War II. Nazism in our timeline was a quick experiment. It burnt hot, but quickly was snuffed out.
True.
We can never...
Yeah, you gotta think, right? The 1,000-year Reich, and it only lasted for what, 12 years? Right?
Truly know how Nazis would hold on to their great empire if they achieved military victory. This scenario was simply the best case scenario for the Nazis, considering they don't botch the odds against themselves. If things did not go perfectly for the Nazis, they would deal with full-out insurrection, rebellion, and civil war in occupied territories, and perhaps even fighting amongst Nazis inside the party in Germany itself.
That's an interesting idea. So, assuming Hitler lives, I think there wouldn't be that factionalism that would have existed. You have to think of the players like Himmler, Bormann, Göring, and these other sorts of high-ranking players. But I think if Hitler lives and he gets victory, I can't see there being any dissent at that point, because that's really the nail. Because you got to think the only reason why a lot of the German officers revolted is because Germany was losing, right? And if they had won, I think they really would have cemented the power in the party.
All which would certainly harm the stability of the Third Reich. If Nazism was to survive and keep its hold on Europe, it would need to deeply ingrain itself in the hearts and minds of the conquered. Military victories would certainly give credit to the government, but two other factors are just as important: economic stability and the infallibility of the leader. In this alternate scenario, if the Nazi economic model held up, created jobs, and allowed good standards of living in the first decade after the war, Europeans would not only accept the new status of German domination, but actively support the fascist governments set up in place. It would legitimize fascism as a new theory to govern by, like monarchy, democracy, or socialism. Nazism is practically a cult, one that takes the word of the Führer, Adolf Hitler, as law. If Hitler or a new leader somehow lost credibility within the early years of the Reich, the system would be at risk of being weakened. As the decades move on, this becomes less of a risk as Nazism forms a solid bedrock foundation through myth and legend. The best comparison is with the founding fathers to the United States. Violence is used across...
Is it? Is that really the best comparison? I mean, okay. I'll let it slide.
Fascist Europe against political opponents and critics, silencing any immediate threats by gunpoint or deportation. This decreases the threat of rebellion as political critics are killed off with frightening efficiency. What would life be like for the average German inside the Third Reich? In our timeline, the Western world sees a capitalist and consumerist lifestyle.
Right, and I think World War II was really... World War I was arguably the beginning, but World War II was really the kickoff of the 21st century being the... not the 21st. The 20th century being the century of America. Right, and you got to think if Germany had won World War One, maybe it might have been the century of the Germanic. Maybe it might have been the Germanic century. Who knows? We'll get into that. We'll get to a World War One. What if Germany won that war? One of these days.
The state rules everything. In Australia, emus and dingoes wage brutal genocide against the populace. What could we expect in an alternate Nazi Germany society? It's
very quickly. That's a reference to the Emu War, in which the Australian army tried to take out a bunch of emus, and they were ultimately incredibly unsuccessful trying to wage a genocidal campaign against emus. And it's a bit of a meme in Hoi 4 too.
Difficult to assume how a short experiment like the Confederate States could have survived without the North. It would be just as difficult to assume the peacetime economic policies of the Third Reich, say a decade or two after the war. Like I said, Nazism was a movement which burned hot and went out fast.
Yep.
Its creation and sustainability in our timeline depended on having an enemy to fight. This isn't
Absolutely.
to say it would collapse,
100%.
but it certainly would have to adapt to a continent without enemies. Nazism didn't place economics as a crucially important thing. Hitler saw economic policy as simply a way to fuel the eventual war effort and sustain it, a secondary factor to building the army and achieving Lebensraum. It's hard to predict how the Third Reich could handle its own economy after the war and after the Russians were destroyed. Nazism was a product of its time. Predicting its economy would be comparable to predicting how the United States would run its internal affairs today based off how the economy was conducted in 1920. We wouldn't see crucial factors which propped up and changed the course. So predict...
Yeah, and then there's obviously lots of altist mods on Hoi 4 that get into that. But just to briefly talk about the economy, yeah, he's 100% correct as far as I understand, that the entire Nazi economy was based around the war. And again, there's a book that I linked in the last video of a book on Germany's economy, so go check that one out. And yeah, everything was based around the war. And Kershaw points this out as well in his biography of Hitler, which is something I'd also really recommend.
Predicting how Hitler could have dealt with, say, an economic crash or an oil crisis would not be entirely accurate. I can't go into much detail about how the German economy would be after the war, but I can say a brief generalization. I believe that the Reich would organize its economy simply off of Lebensraum. Every part of the German society, the economy, government, and people itself was simply to wipe out the enemies of the Reich. Once Lebensraum was achieved, I believe in this alternate timeline, the Nazi Party would reorganize the economy away from the war effort and focus its economy on what best suits maintaining the land it conquered.
Yes.
Standard of living can fall.
And this would be also reorganizing to enforce the ethnic cleansing that they talked about in part 1. And you can just only imagine the resources they would have put into that, considering all the resources they put into the Holocaust while the war was going on, right, to their detriment. So.
Production of goods can fall. Starvation could occur, but the Nazis would never allow 1 inch of land to fall into the hands of the enemy. The Reich never trades with nations outside its realm of influence. This isn't much of a problem considering the Reich has influence over the British, French, and Italians for resources. Raw materials are harnessed through slave labor in the Russian colonies. The German people could see a society of great wealth and prosperity, or one of poverty and rations. No matter what in this alternate timeline, their fate would depend on the military expeditions of the Reich. Society would accept that above all else, territory is what truly matters, above individual fulfillment. In our timeline, one thing that stands out about Nazi Germany, apart from the brutal conquest and genocidal nature, was the advances the Germans made in military technology. How would this have progressed if the Third Reich had not collapsed? Eugenics, social Darwinism, and genealogy were all popular across the Western world at the time, but
I'm thinking, oh no, because is it time for Wunderwaffen armchair history, or what? Let's find out.
Used by the calculating Nazis to legitimize their objectives for the Aryan race. These were not new ideas created by Hitler, but they were areas of academia that the Nazis harnessed for their own ideology. In our timeline, Nazism made eugenics and social Darwinism unpopular, but had they won the war, research and the ideas would have become far more popular across Europe and the globe. Inhuman experiments on Untermensch still continue in this alternate timeline, sponsored by the government. Scientific advancement is determined by politics. In our timeline, half of Germans in university were studying medicine. Genetics and medical studies were preferred by the state to maintain a healthy and efficient Aryan race. Women would be discouraged from pursuing education or careers that were not beneficial to producing children. Technology is only advanced that is positive to the state. Tech that is threatening to the Reich is discouraged to be continued. Communication like cell phones, the internet, and other forms of communication easy to spread ideas are killed in development.
Okay. I don't think about that one. That seems a little bit far-fetched, right? Because then that's making the assumption that something like cell phones and the internet wouldn't be used by the state to enhance its own goals, right? Having open messages for people. And to use an example, actually, radios were actually produced by the German government and given to people, and this was considered a bit of a luxury item at the time during the 1930s. But obviously the secondary objective was to broadcast propaganda, right? And so to say that cell phones and the internet would be canceled, assuming the Nazi state even gets that far, right? Let's talk about maybe the 1980s, 1990s, call it, maybe the 70s. Yeah, I don't agree with that one. I mean, you can use the internet, obviously, to control people. We all know within our own timeline in 2022 right now which countries use the internet to reinforce their own state messages. I think it needs to go on. It doesn't even need to be said which ones do that. But yeah, that's probably my first disagreement that I have with these videos so far. It just doesn't seem right. It seems too overreaching. You know, obviously the Nazi state had a lot of control, but this just seems like one step a little bit too far.
Never made available to the masses.
Yeah,
Generations of lawyers, scholars, scientists, and engineers grow up fed the propaganda of the state. If Nazi plans were successful, the intellectuals of Nazi Germany hold an extremely violent ideology close to heart. If communication is advanced, it will only be in the control of the state. Technology,
again,
which makes the exchange of ideas easier, would
don't
be
need to pause. Just my point again. My point
Television and radio are left under the control of the regime. With the
And again, like if TV and radio are in control of the regime, then anyways, I digress.
German economy dedicated to the military, weapon technology advances much faster than in our timeline. In this alternate timeline, a continent-wide empire uses most of its resources to get an advantage over its enemies. Moving on, in this alternate timeline across the continent, fascism wouldn't be one universal cookie-cut ideology. Each nation would adapt fascist beliefs to their national identity. For example, France, Italy, and Spain would boast Catholicism as their national religion. Make fascism more acceptable, it would be associated with already existing ideas.
And this would be he brought up in part one that the Catholic Church, right, the church question would be answered and then Catholics would be seized and you know, sort of treated also as sort of Untermenschen, right, second-class citizens. But again, with France and Italy being your partners, with how Catholic they are, I don't know. That was also, maybe that's another thing that I sort of disagree with him on. Less disagree and more, a bit more mixed. So again, I just don't know if the role of the Catholics would be so easy to persuade the German populace to sort of rid themselves of Catholicism, as AlternateHistoryHub here is proclaiming, but who knows? It's just a theory.
In our timeline, Vichy France created laws which were to reverse the effects of the liberal French Revolution. In this alternate scenario, this is the universal theme across Nazi-influenced Europe, as liberal and Enlightenment beliefs are slowly strangled. In France, the government creates a more conservative, authoritarian, and Catholic state. This is different than the Nazis, as Hitler aimed to reinvent German society. The Vichy French simply used the existing conservative elements of French society. Nazi persecution of Catholics in their eastern territories creates tension between the French and Germans, but faced with the overwhelming threat of force, the Vichy French would voice little public opinion about it and do little action against it. In our timeline, the Nazis held French prisoners of war as practical hostages in labor camps. I believe in this alternate scenario, the same tactics would be used to make sure the populace and governments would not react against German puppet masters. Britain and its empire become the apple in the eye for the...
And so maybe this could be sort of and again, this is it's just a fun hist video, but maybe that could be a sparking point for resistance against the Nazi state. And God knows we have enough examples in history of religious tensions being something that sparks war. So I think that it's a little bit more reasonable to think that it might be something that actually would spark resistance, and that's something that they would actually speak out against, especially because if you have something like France and Italy, you know, that could maybe even revolt in some sort of matter, especially in a joint alliance, or if the United States helps them, which we haven't talked about what's going on in the United States yet, but there's still two more parts. But I really think that Catholic question is something that sort of, and the church question is really something to stick on.
Germans. In this alternate timeline, Britain has lost the air battle with the Luftwaffe, and German troops successfully invaded and occupied the island nation. The royal family fled to Canada, but the remaining remnants of the British government are dissolved, replaced with a temporary military government. After the invasion, the occupying Germans treat the British kindly, even going so far to pay for goods and services. The plan was to ease the occupied British into accepting the new government.
I'm pausing a lot on this one. I'll be quick. I believe the island is called Jersey, I want to say. It's the only British territory that was actually seized by the Nazis in World War II in our timeline. And they sort of ran their own system of government there, where there were the Nazis there and they were clearly occupying the territory, but they had the townspeople working for them, but they were sort of treated not as slave labor, but also like equal employees in a manner, and they were paid a sum, and they, from what I remember reading, they generally got along as well. And there was not any of this sort of brutal repression as there was in other parts of occupied territories, even in somewhere like, even in France. So I wonder if this what happened on this island, I think it's Jersey. I might be wrong on that. Sorry if I screwed that one up on my UK geography. I wonder if that would sort of be a system that would be implemented. Maybe that's where he's taking the inspiration from. So
disband any fear from the stories of Poland and Russia. It would be a campaign of kindness. However, after months of kindness, the Germans would secretly implement purges against any political and social groups seen as a threat to the Reich.
So kind of ruining your campaign of kindness.
After occupying Britain for an unspecified amount of time, the Nazis would allow a puppet British government to operate once again. This is also needed to maintain the global empire that stretched across Africa and Asia. Switzerland would have eventually fell.
Whoa, didn't even think of that. So what about all the British overseas territories? Like, what is going on in India? What is going on in Australia, New Zealand? Is New Australia captured by the Japanese at this point? What's happening in India? What's happening in the Middle East? Wow, I wonder if he's going to get into that in parts 3 and 4. But because the British Empire at this point was massive, right? It wasn't at its absolute peak as it was, I believe, in 1890, I want to say, maybe in the 1920s. I don't remember off the top of my head. But still, the British obviously have a lot of influence, especially with the royal family fleeing to Canada. So I wonder how that sort of resistance would play out too in these foreign lands, and how much of the British Empire has Germany actually captured. So, maybe What If Altist is going to cover that one. And don't worry, I'm going to do his video on What If Germany won World War II as well.
Hitler absolutely despised the Swiss.
Yes,
he would have invaded had the war in Russia not gone so terribly.
And it would have been a nightmare to invade the Swiss.
In this alternate timeline, if Hitler was able to win the war on both fronts, Switzerland is invaded and dissolved. Alternate timeline, I believe the relationship between Nazi Germany and Italy would have gotten far worse.
And I think too, the Italian-speaking parts of Switzerland probably would have went to the Italians. And I wonder if the French-speaking parts would have went to the French, so this Vichy French puppet government, because Switzerland, a lot of people think of Switzerland as sort of this ethnically homogenous place. However, there's very clear divides between Italian, French, and then native German speaking populaces as well. So I'd be kind of curious to see if Switzerland would split in this sort of manner, or if it would just be straight up taken by Nazi Germany.
Worse. I mentioned in part 1 how Hitler's views on race created tension between him and Benito Mussolini. But this wasn't the only issue between the two. In our timeline, the relationship between Italy and Germany was one of convenience and military protection. The war pact was one that would last only 10 years. That was it. While Italy under Mussolini talked a big game, it simply did not have the resources or industrialization that Germany did to reclaim the Roman Empire. Mussolini even told Hitler that Italy would not be ready for a war at least until 1942, upon which Hitler ignored and invaded Poland, dragging the Italians along with him. Modern Italy was simply not built for fighting. As the conflict raged on, the Italian armies failed to capture North Africa and the Balkans. Relations between the two deteriorated. I predict the relationship going down 2 possible paths. 1, after the defeat of the Russians and no real enemy on the horizon, the Italians simply become too much of a burden and Nazi Germany invades their former ally.
The other thing too, and I'm not going to get totally into it because it's not the point of this video, but the Italian army actually does deserve a lot more credit in World War II than it gets. The sort of meme around the Italian army is that they were this useless force that did absolutely nothing, but they were really a ferocious fighting force against just the biggest issue that they had was leadership. Leadership, and that was because there was a lot of cronyism, there was a lot of plutocracy happening in Italy at the time, and just some Italian generals, and again, not all, but some were just terrible, right? I believe one of Italy's top generals too, I don't remember his name off the top of my head, or maybe I think he was a chief of the Air Force. He was actually killed in a plane crash, but he seemed to be highly competent. And so Italy was really lacking a lot of highly competent leadership, which led to the result, which led to the failure of the Italian army.
Northern Italy is assimilated into the Reich. Southern Italy is devolved into a poor outer state. The Italians are unable to put up much of a resistance against the massive, powerful German war machine. Second, if the relationship remained stable and Germany did not invade, the Nazis would have loomed over Italy for decades. Mussolini's Italian Empire is nothing more than a puppet to the Nazi Reich. Italy could hold territory in the Balkans, Mediterranean, and North Africa. However, it is dependent on Germany to maintain control over them. In the immediate aftermath of Nazi victory, thousands die from government neglect, rape, and reprisals for uprisings against the occupiers. Even in states like Greece, Yugoslavia, and other regions not set for depopulation like in Russia, Europe's map is redrawn to include regimes only loyal to the Axis. Greece is renamed to the Hellenic Republic. Yugoslavia is
I think it's the Hellenic Union in Hoi 4.
Disbanded and split among the independent state of Croatia, Albania, and Italy.
Yeah, and just to talk about the Balkans very briefly, because it's never a good idea to talk about the Balkans at times. Yeah, the absolute brutality that the Croatian, the Ustacija, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. And there was a lot of tension in that region during the time, and you can only imagine what would happen if the Croatians had, been able to sort of dominate the Balkans in that manner. You can only imagine the absolute travesty that would have happened during this time.
In this alternate timeline, Europe is transformed into a new age.
And again, to be very clear, Balkan, there is lots of bad things that happened on all sides during the Second World War and the breakup of Yugoslavia, and since then. So hey, don't get me wrong here. I'm not just targeting Croatians. I'm not just targeting any sort of certain country. I'm saying that it's a very complicated region. There's lots of tensions in it.
In this age, a generation of Europeans are born into a society which encourages violence, lack of individuality, and glory to the state. The thinkers of the Enlightenment and French Revolution are despised, and literature from classical liberal thinkers have been destroyed. As more are born into this world, the easier it becomes to maintain the myth of Adolf Hitler. Any form of political opinion simply branches off as a form of Nazism, an entire alternate world of political thought, based on the progression of the Aryan race. Europeans are taught of the ominous force across the Atlantic, an enemy just like the Jews and communists, the United States.
Okay,
Tune in
good.
for part 3, which I guarantee will not take 2 weeks to make. This is Cody of the Alternate History.
Cool. So the only thing that he hasn't talked about that I really wanted him to talk about, what happens to Bulgaria? What happens to Romania? What happens to Hungary? That's what I'm interested in. I want to know what happens with the Axis minor powers. I don't think he's going to get into it. But again, another really cool video. I agreed with a lot of what he said there. A few things, though, I disagreed on. But hey, nonetheless, I think this is really well made. And I'm very curious what if Altist is going to do, because I'll be covering his video, like I said. So yeah, stay tuned for part 3 and part 4. I'm just going to release them one after another. So throughout this week, you'll see part 3, you'll see part 4. Then we'll get back into, I think I'm going to do another Canadian video after that. Maybe I'll get away from World War II. We'll see. Anyways, thank you all very much for watching. Take care. See you guys in the next one.